Hey folks, we're continuing on with our podcast series, Becoming an Embodied Catholic Leader, today exploring the principle of ownership.
Ownership, gonna be so good. This is probably one of my favorites, actually. There's that level of self-awareness and then self-possession, and I really love this. And it needs to happen before you give of yourself.
Yes. One of our operating principles we're going to go into next is influence, and a lot of people jump to that because we're leaders, right? We want to influence the people around us to get on board with the vision that we've discerned. But folks, if you skip over ownership, you will not influence. You will manipulate with the best of intentions. So yes, this ownership principle is absolutely essential to the effective execution of this vision that the Lord's put on your heart.
Yes.
We'll see you in the podcast.
Hello, welcome back.
Welcome back to the Catholic Coaching Podcast. My name is Matt.
And I'm Erin.
Hey, we're the Ingolds. We're the founders of Metanoia Catholic. As if you don't know that already, all of our dedicated listeners, we just hit 250,000 podcast downloads.
It's so cool.
I'm really excited about that.
And I know nothing about podcast metrics, so I'm like, is that good? Is it bad? I don't know.
We're going to call it a win.
Yay.
Hey, thank you so much for sharing the podcast, liking the podcast, subscribing to the podcast. If you haven't done that yet, please invite you to like and subscribe. Hit that little bell that lets you know when we have a new episode that releases. We have an episode that releases every week. And thank you so much for writing a review. Write a review. Give us a good review here too as well.
Yeah, it'd be cool to actually read off some of the reviews. So if you go in there, maybe we could read it off to you and you can... Yeah, that would be cool. All right.
We are continuing on with our leadership series, okay? We're calling it Becoming the Embodied Catholic Leader. And at the beginning, we spoke about how there's often these leadership principles that are presented to us, and then there's just like, become more courageous, become more adaptable, or whatever principle that gets thrown at us. But there's not really a consideration of how one becomes that, and also or the unique way that they become that.
Or the person's unique design, because adaptability might be not the way for that person, and maybe they could be flexible in other ways. So
yes. So we're saying that if you really want to embody these leadership principles, there's two things you really need to consider, and they become the right and left lungs to Metanoia Catholic. That first thing is we have to consider our mindsets. All right, what's going on in our minds, in our interior life. We know from John Paul II, the body and it alone is capable of making visible the invisible reality of the person, what is spirit and divine. We read that in Theology of the Body. But then also we need to consider our unique design. We reflect on Psalm 139. We see here we are fashioned in the depths, knit in our mother's womb. There's something different about each one of us. We are indeed a unique logos, a unique word that has come forth from the Father and will not return to him until it's accomplished its purpose. Right? In the same way that you have auto manufacturers that will design a car with a different purpose in mind. You can look at a truck, you can look at a Ferrari. The designer has a different purpose for those two vehicles. We can reflect on certain aspects of who we are, then certain habits in a sense, and we can start to get an idea of our unique design. And when we reflect on design, we can start to understand unique purpose in the same way that we look at a truck and we say, okay, purpose, haul a load. Ferrari, purpose, look expensive, look good.
Yeah.
Go fast.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I like that analogy.
Okay, but today we're diving further into these principles. So we've introduced a couple of Metanoia Catholic leadership principles. Just got done exploring that through the lenses of the four temperaments. That's what we're leaning on here for exploring unique design. It's not the only way that you can explore unique design. I
would say, or the most in-depth way. It is a starting point for sure.
Yes, yeah, it's helpful. We've got our free assessment. Go take it. It's in the show notes. Take a look, and so we can get a little bit more into this. Today, we're going to be exploring our principle of ownership. Okay, so ownership. This is one that I think, I don't know how, well, you've heard Jocko Willink talks about extreme ownership.
Yep.
I don't know if we're going to be sharing it the same way that Jocko shares it. Okay, Jocko, it's like this extreme responsibility, owning success, owning defeat, owning other people's failures on the team, taking that strong accountability. Certainly, we can see the merit in that, and no no digs on Jocko. Okay?
Yeah, but
Jocko can bury me if he wants to.
That's right. There are some distinctions, though, between like, some of those points that you just made. So
yes.
Ownership. Do you want to just really quick run through the 5 operating principles? We
Sure.
covered, so if you guys want to go back, we already covered discerning the vision, because we know that leaders are visionaries, right? They kind of bring others into the same vision that they are in. But as Catholic leaders, we want to be open to the leader, God, actually sharing his vision with us. That was the first operating principle. And we took kind of everybody through each of the temperaments and where they maybe struggle with that in that discernment process and where they thrive. But now we're moving on to ownership. And I think this is actually my favorite operating principle out of everything. I think because it moves you from this place of self-awareness to self-possession. So if we're going from self-awareness to self-possession to self-gift, we are kind of now in that second phase here. And it requires knowledge.
Right. And it paves the way for the next principle we'll get into, which is persuasion.
Influence.
Yes. Goodness gracious. Why do I keep going that way?
I don't know.
Okay. Influence. So we go to influence. So I think we recognize that influence is an important principle for a leader to have. If you're not influencing other people to get on board with the vision, arguably you're not really leading other people. So, and then we'll get into what that looks like in a virtuous sense and embodying that in a virtuous sense based on your unique design. But oftentimes people jump right into influence and they skip over ownership, and that's a big problem, right? Because you're not going to influence properly. You're going to manipulate. You won't influence. Okay,
yes.
More on that when we get into influence. But this is why ownership is so key, right?
It's so key. And this isn't just for leaders, by the way. This is for humans. Humans need to know how to own things. Okay, so
after influence, we have.
Oh yeah, after influence, then we have optimizing your resources, and then the final one is producing value.
Yes. So again, optimizing the resource. You can see how all these things build on one another. Okay, so ownership. Again, we spoke about discerning the vision, and oftentimes when we want to move to persuade or influence other people, stick with our language. We have the vision, and then we start to think about how we're going to make the vision a reality. That's what a leader's doing. Okay. And then we can often, like, the mindset stuff starts to bubble to the surface. All of the doubts that you have in your team, the doubts that you have in yourself. I'm not smart enough over here.
All of your limitations.
Doubts you have in the market, like these conditions aren't right. And all the mind trash can start to float to the surface. Okay. And it can really frustrate you moving forward as a leader. What do you want to say?
Yeah, can I add something to this? Why ownership is important to leadership? I mean, why it's important to all humans, but specifically in leadership, because when you own your stuff, when you own the things that we're going to be talking about today, you create a culture of ownership under you. You also create trust. I think a lot of people think, if I ignore my problems, if I ignore my things and I don't take ownership, now people will respect me and they'll follow me. The opposite is true. You will create trust. I want you guys all to think about some person who has led you through something, right? Maybe a boss, maybe a leader on a team or whatever. And think about, and I know this is an extreme form, but think about if maybe they struggled with taking ownership of things. Maybe they never owned, that's mine to own. Not even just abdicating work over to other people, but just even abdicating, like not saying sorry, right? If something didn't go wrong, right? Or something. But just never owning their mistakes, never even owning up to it. Was your trust for them increased or decreased at that point?
Right.
Did you want to continue to follow this person? Did you want to continue? Did you trust this person more or less?
It's like a parent who never apologizes.
a parent, a leader, anybody who doesn't apologize. So I think it builds trust. I think it builds a culture of humility and a culture and even compassion too, because if a leader can take ownership and say, I'm sorry, that's my bad, that's mine to own, now other people on the team have that permission to do that as well. Mm-hmm. And I think that ultimately, I think, is the reason why it's so powerful to own as a leader. Yeah,
it creates that culture of ownership that Aaron was talking about. And we value it so much. It's one of our core values at Metanoia Catholic. We call it responsibility. Mm-hmm. And we define that as do your own work and never do somebody else's work for them. Mm-hmm. Right. And so we can see that there's a little bit of boundaries that are built into that, but also there's this recognition of what's in your control, what's outside of your control. We're going to get into a lot of that as we speak through how you start to embody this principle of ownership. Because when you don't, I'm telling you what, you can, instead of building a culture of ownership, you start to build a culture of resentment
and pain,
a culture of blaming others, mm-hmm. a culture of shifting responsibility. And really there's nobody's taking responsibility. It's just, it gets very blame shifting. You create a culture of covering your butt, right?
Fear.
And that's fear that's mm-hmm. there. Versus one where it's like, okay, I can recognize that something's going on in me. Let's get curious about that. Why am I feeling this way? Is this something that needs to be brought to the team? I mean, we've even seen it where Aaron's had to kind of come to me at times and be like, hey, Matt, you seem a little bit nervous about this, or you bring this up, you're calling this a problem. Is this really a problem? And I've had to do a little bit of my work on that because sometimes I'll perceive things as a problem to the business, and that will impact the way that I show up, right? When it's not actually a problem. And so again, that's my own work to do, and I need to learn how to own those things. Now, what does that look like? That's really what we're going to get into. Yeah. So there's two things mm-hmm. that we say you have to consider in order to properly embody this principle of ownership.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The first thing is to know and own God's incarnational design.
Okay, so tell me a little bit more about that. Know and own God's incarnational design. What does that mean?
Basically, how he designed the human, right? So there's this, to simplify it, you have thoughts that lead to emotions, which lead to your actions and decisions.
Okay. Oh, it's like extreme simplification here. Okay, so
very simple.
The psychologists that are listening in are going to be like, "What? That's not like that's." There's so much more to it. Yes, we know there's so much more to it, but for practical purposes, which is always what we're trying to do at Metanoia, mm-hmm. we're just starting here. All right, just knowing that we have the feelings that we feel are coming from a thought. The actions that we're doing, mm-hmm. we're being inclined to those actions by an emotion that's being generated by a thought. Okay. Mm-hmm. Thoughts are things that we can choose. All right. This is so liberating when it comes to, like right now, I'm choosing to think thoughts that you can't hear all the lawnmowers behind because we purchased incredible microphones, right?
Yes.
And, you can't hear a thing, right? Even though there's literally a weed whacker about 5 feet away from me.
Right outside our window.
I'm owning my thoughts and I'm saying, okay, it's not true. We've made the good investment in the microphones. Anyways.
Yes.
Now the dog is barking like crazy. Okay.
So basically it's knowing this order and accepting it. That's what owning this looks like.
Okay.
And I think this is powerful because when you own that, when you actually accept it and say, I cannot change this thing. Mm-hmm. Now you go, what next?
What do I do? Am
what
I
just
do powerless,
now? Right.
Or how can I approach this from a very empowered standpoint? And this is the bulk of the mindset work that we do at Metanoia Catholic. This is why we created our journal, our Metanoia journal, which walks through the process of taking thoughts captive and growing in custody of your mind, being transformed by the renewing of your mind. So it's owning just the reality of how God has designed you, mm-hmm. right? And how the interior life will always be made visible in and through your bodies. Okay, what's the second thing, Aaron?
The second thing is owning your property lines.
I love this.
Some people might call this boundaries, but what I like is this kind of simplifies it as well, because property lines insinuate ownership, right? Mm-hmm. We live right next door to our neighbors, and we're like, here's our property line. Our dog can poop there, and then she can't poop over on the other side, right? Because that's rude. So
we pick up our dog poop. By the way.
Yes, exactly. Right. But still, it's owning these property
Smells
lines.
do not know property line boundaries.
Yes. So what does this mean? So I want you guys to picture 2 circles, And then within these two circles, there is a thought, an emotion, and action and decision. And then on the other circle, there's a thought, emotion, action, and decision. By the way, if you're listening to this audibly, go subscribe at YouTube so you can see my hand movements. So I can help you paint this picture a little bit more. So you have those two circles next to each other. One person has a thought, an emotion, an action, and decision. Another person has a thought, emotion, action, and decision.
I have my thoughts, emotions, actions, decisions, values. Erin has her own thoughts, actions, values, decisions.
And you can add into that circle other things like gifts, strengths, all of these other elements, motivations, all of these other elements of that unique design, but they are two different things. This is really helpful to know because when you're on a team working towards something together, to be able to delegate those roles and also know if I'm jumping over into yours or I'm abdicating what's mine into yours.
Spilling over into my container.
Yes, exactly.
As Michelle Dunn would say.
Yes, spilling over. Which can happen. You can do that. And that kind of moves you into a place where you do not want to be. You waste a lot of time and energy doing that. So
now, you may be thinking that, well, wait a second. Like those circles kind of overlap, right? Don't worry. We're going to get into that. We're going to get into that when we talk on our influencer principle. Okay. Yeah. But for now, it's really important to just understand that there are two distinct people, two distinct circles, and there are two distinct owners, all right, governors of what's in that circle and what happens inside of that circle, all right? And if we can't figure that out, when it comes time to influence, we're going to end up manipulating.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's start there, and that's an important piece to own.
Yes.
Okay.
Really important. Okay, so what are some, you already kind of talked about them, but what are some symptoms from this lack of ownership on a team? Yeah,
we're going to kind of take a look here. First, what are the kind of the fallout of a lack of ownership, and then we're going to do the flip side. What happens when you really start to own? That's where we're selling this principle a little bit more. Because heads up, we're going to be moving on and exploring these again through the lenses of the four temperaments, right, and the problems people have with owning and their strengths to owning based on their temperament. But I'd say one of the first things that comes to mind as a problem, like when people don't own properly, they don't embody this principle in their organization, is there's a lot of blaming. There's a lot of blaming. There's a lot of finger pointing that's going on. But
blaming can also happen silently too.
Yeah, but I think of blaming being like there's it's almost like a victim-y place that it's coming from. It's just like, well, this wouldn't have happened if you hadn't done this over here. Okay, well,
I think also though, Matt, I think people blame circumstances too.
They can blame circumstances,
not just
certainly.
people.
Yes.
Oh, I can't move forward because of this.
Yes.
And actually, we were just talking to someone on our team the other day, and she had this revelation in prayer that it was she was like, I just realized I was waiting on somebody else to move, and then I realized I could just shift and do something over here.
Yes.
And it was kind of just taking that ownership back. That sometimes circumstances get in the way of what you need to do.
Yeah.
And so what are you going to do? Are you going to blame those circumstances until it changes, or are you going to do something else?
Yeah. So a classic example of blaming circumstances is hey, we're in the middle of recession or something like that, so therefore we just can't sell. Okay. Or we can't do anything. It's
yeah.
Okay, so we can't change the reality that maybe there is, we got to define really what that is. Or we can't say COVID, for example. Everything's shut down, so we can't go to church, or we can't do blah, 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 blah. What is that, and then we move to this place of, okay, because of this, I'm powerless.
Yes.
Right? Blaming comes from a very powerless place, and powerless often what comes with that is an abdication of what's in your circle here, folks. All right. So when we're feeling powerless, and this comes from a culture that lacks ownership, when we blame, it's often coming from a place of powerlessness, and where we say we're not taking any sort of responsibility for doing what we can do. Now, this doesn't mean that we can't ever go to somebody and say, hey, it would make it a lot easier for me to operate if you would start acting this way or you start doing this. Doesn't mean that we can't make requests.
Right, exactly. Yeah, but like when that blaming becomes part of the culture, and even it becomes habituated in a person, it doesn't help anything. It doesn't help projects move faster. It doesn't help anybody create more. It just you go inward, and it like just is it's very fruitless.
Yes, we've certainly seen it on parishes,
and it creates a lot of division. Yes.
Yeah, yes, and us versus them. And the sad part is you're not seeing the other person. You're not seeing the other person for their gifts. You're not honoring their unique design at that point. And so you're seeing the person as you have to paint the person as the enemy at that point. Like,
well, that's every victim needs a villain.
Exactly.
You know, and so if you are in this habit of blaming, maybe you're like, oh, that's me a little bit, right?
Yeah, or it's in your organization, or in your family,
or it's right
in your marriage.
There has to be villains. And so maybe that's a way of kind of discerning this and be like, do we have lots of villains in our culture? Is it each other? Is it like, the economy? Is it the...
Gosh, this is like, I'm so sick of entering conversations with people that all they want to do is they want to talk about all the problems in the church. I'm just sick of it. Or all the problems in government. I'm sick of it. It doesn't mean that we can't look at those things, but there's so much abdication that I perceive happening at that point. It's like, okay, well, all right, well, you're not going to change who's the Pope, or who's the cardinal, or who your bishop is. It's like or who your parish priest is even. Like that's outside of your control, your locus of control. What are you going to do? What's something inside your locus of control? And so that blaming thing, the sad part is we never take charge of what is within our little plot of land. I love the way that St. John Vianney would always talk about, Lord, you give me this little plot of land. And he just stayed there.
He owned it.
Owned it. That was it. He owned it. So 3,000 people living in that town, and they were all converted. And people were just flocking because they wanted to go into his confessional, and incredible saints. But he owned what was given to him. And even as humble as it was, he owned it.
Yeah.
Yeah, another thing that I think pops up in this where there's a lack of ownership is there's a lot of time that's being spent,
time and
energy that's being spent on managing other people's emotions.
Yes.
It gets very manipulative at that point.
Yeah, and it's very subtle too, because like I can give an example even in our own business. I like looking for holes and gaps and needs and filling them. But I have to be careful if I'm doing that to change people's emotions. Right? Like, so it's like, okay, like for instance, like, oh, the resident coaches, whatever, like, let's help them, just kind of get out there more. Right? So we have resident coaches. And then like, I kind of go into my mind and I'm like, how do we make this like super easy for them? And I think that's a great question. But also underneath all that is like, how do we like avoid pain for them? Which I think intentionally is really good. But when you are doing something new, that pain, that resistance is good. It strengthens you.
Yeah,
a little bit.
It's the currency.
Right.
Yeah,
that discomfort is the currency. And like for me to try to steal that from them would be
opening the cocoon rather than letting the butterfly fight its way out.
Right. And so
it actually kills the butterfly.
So we want to kind of paint this as like, it's not always like these malicious, like I'm trying to manipulate somebody.
Yeah, rare actually.
Yeah, right. It's usually like, I want to try to change this person's emotion because I want them to feel better so I can feel better.
Yeah. I recall being on the team, guys, and this is like, every team has got its dysfunctions, but like there was a person who I always felt like I needed to manage her emotions, and because if she shut down, a lot of what I was doing, a lot of my work was like hinged on her doing her stuff, right? And so there was this fear that if I ticked her off, she would stop doing the work, or she'd have some sort of like, resentment. And so I would I noticed this. I've never shared this before. It's almost embarrassing, right? But I had a way of, I noticed this when I would go into her office and I would speak. I found my eyes would start to dew up, almost like there's like not like I'm gonna cry, but there was like this. I had a way of putting on this real vulnerable facade that was like, don't get mad at me. Don't like I'm just coming in here like
look at my dewy eyes.
Look at my dewy eyes. I'm just like a vulnerable child, right? That, be kind. Like I noticed that, and it was like it wasn't authentic, right? But but I was just like, wow, how is this? I wasn't even conscious of doing something. It was something I noticed, right?
Huh.
And I think back to what we're always hearing on the behavior panel. The organism does what has worked for the organism in its past.
Yeah.
Right. And so at some point I learned that this approach was going to be, versus like the blunt, or say as if there's only two extremes that I got to approach it.
Right.
As if just being a little bit more straightforward and being like, hey, this is what I need.
But also
blah, blah, blah.
loving and charitable.
Exactly. Yeah. Like this is the only way. And so it was like, okay, that's where I was showing up in my manipulation a bit.
Yeah, so it comes in really subtle forms, okay? I don't want everyone to think there's we're every time we say somebody manipulates that you are like a narcissist, whatever, like a malignant narcissist out there. We manipulate for a lot of different reasons, and a lot of it, the main reason is we don't know how to approach it any other way, right? It's either become a habit, like you were saying, it's been habituated in it, but we've never been taught another way too.
Yeah, and I could see how I was protecting myself, and like now what this is doing, which kind of leads to a third way that this is really detrimental to the team, is I was never actually able to have a really good dialogue with this person because there was this.
Define good, like honest?
A good, honest dialogue where it's just like, hey, you know what? I want to work better with you. I want to work more just seamless with you. I don't want to step on your toes. I want it to be a good experience for it. This is what would be helpful for me, I think, or this is something I perceive. There just wasn't like that open dialogue.
Yeah.
And so this is, which would have been really helpful. And this is something that I think often happens in a team where there's no ownership, is there's just you never really get to the root of problems, especially amongst your teammates. It happens, it stays on a very surface level, but the real problem is never really dealt with.
Which is? What's the real problem?
The real problem is
lack of ownership and lack of mindset.
Well, yeah, thank you. I just tested you and you failed.
I didn't mean to do that. It came to me, though.
It's a trap.
I was thinking, though, that if you had something else.
Yeah, that's like, it brings me back
in which you would have failed.
It brings me back to our pastor Acer, back when we were in the Lutheran church, and little Matt Ingold was up on the altar, and the pastor asked a question, and it was a pop quiz question, and he was like, Matthew, who created the world? And I got a little bit nervous, and I just said, we into the microphone.
Very nice.
My parents hid in the pews after that, and after that, we were so ashamed of being going back to the church that we became Catholic.
Nice.
No, more to that story. But anyways, so yeah, we don't address problems at the level, right? Okay, so I think of an example of this where even in the home, of parental controls on devices. Okay, so I am an advocate of parental controls on devices in the home. Like the what are they called? Like covenant eyes, those things, because it's so insidious, right? So I'm not saying that don't have parental devices, but if all we're doing is we're just having parental devices on the phones, but as our kids are growing up and maturing and getting to an age where you can enter into a dialogue with them about avoiding certain things and why and what honors the body and what doesn't, and who the human person is. Like if we're not having those deeper conversations as soon as they leave, right? they go to college, and that's where all the device controls are gone, and they just go nuts, right? So, but the parental controls can feel like they're really good. And a lot of the time, I think parents have a tough time having the conversation with people because they haven't necessarily owned their own stuff.
Yeah, it's addressing the problem on the behavioral level, and as we've already told you, that's not the root of it. The root of it are the thoughts and the choices and the emotions. Like, that's the root of the behavior. I was just watching this documentary on the Duggars, Shiny Happy People. You guys ever seen that? It's interesting, very interesting. So, watch with discernment. But, there was all of these sex scandals coming out of this. I don't know what better way to call it.
It's a very pious family.
Yes, but also like a group of these people. I don't even know what their religion was called. It was like some religion.
Yes.
And it was because of these strict, there was all of this like behavioral modifications, but it was never spoken about. It was never like, it was just like, do as I say. And then, when you push that down, and you don't teach your children and don't talk about it, don't get to the root of it, it's going to come out some way. Okay, so those were the three. Blaming, you spend time and energy managing, manipulating other people, and then you just address the problems at the surface or the behavioral level, but you don't really get to the bottom of it.
Yeah, and you waste a lot of energy here, folks. Like, that's my choleric coming in that hates wastes.
Yeah.
All right, from my fellow cholerics out there, when you don't own yourself, you will waste a lot. A lot, especially if you're running an organization, you're a leader, you're going to waste.
Yeah.
Right.
And if you're sanguine and you like movement and like novelty and change, you will stay stuck. That is for all you sanguines out there. You will stay stuck if you don't take ownership. Okay, so what do you suggest? What happens when we do own these things?
Yeah, when we start to own these things, I think one of the first things is we get less emotionally reactive to those typical triggers that show up. And so an example of this would be like, I share this one often where I tend to go defensive at times, right? If I feel like there's been some sort of an assault, right? But if I get curious about the defensiveness, oftentimes I find that I'm defending against something that's not really an attack, right? And then I end up going offensive, right? And so having held the space and growing in awareness and growing ownership of that emotion of defensiveness when it shows up and what the thoughts are behind it, I'm not as reactive anymore when that sensation that I can now call defensiveness, I start to feel that in my body. Rather, it's more so, okay, I'm going to get curious
you go to the
about
source,
it. Yeah, I get curious about that, which kind of leads into our second point. What happens is, because I've grown so accustomed of getting curious about what's going on inside of me and discovering that, there's fearfully, wonderfully made, there's a lot going on in there, I start to get more curious about what's going on inside other people.
Yes.
And so there's less judgment out of the gate.
More compassion.
Yes. Yeah. Way more compassion, more curiosity.
And I think another thing that you do is as a byproduct of all of that, you start to build that culture of trust versus that culture of lack of ownership. Because like you guys, leaders go first. If you don't own your stuff, nobody on your team will. I mean, it will be very rare that people on your team will. Maybe there's a unicorn here and there, but like if you're creating that culture within yourself, that is going to be the culture that you create outside of you.
Yeah, that was even something recently where Aaron and I have been just having conversations. I tend to see, so Clifton Strengths, I'm high restorative. I tend to see problems very quickly because I have a delight in solving problems. It's just like a habit I have. It's not necessarily where Erin is inclined, right? Erin is much more positive. It's one of her dominant themes that she's got, Clifton Strengths. And so she sees things in a very hopeful attitude. It doesn't mean that she can't see the potential problems. So oftentimes that was my perception. Because she didn't necessarily voice them the way that I would, my perception would go to,
Pollyanna.
Well, she's just being a Pollyanna. It's a silver lining thinking that's here. It's my job to step in here and inform her where she's lacking, because obviously she doesn't have the ability to do that on her own. Okay, so this is all stuff that's going on. Now, here I am. I'm trying to be helpful here. But there was a perception that was not in line with reality. It was like, okay, because Erin's positive and hopeful, she's incapable of seeing the problems, and so I need to educate her. All right, so that was my thing that I needed to own. And, even today, Erin, we had a conversation where you brought something up, and just knowing that I had this inclination, being able to own that.
Yeah, it was like such a fruitful conversation.
It was an incredibly fruitful conversation where I was able to kind of just hold the space for myself, recognize that there are problems that are immediately popping up, all right, rather than just presenting those, just hold the space for those, listen in, like see the positive side that I know Erin sees very clearly and sees very quickly, right? And being able to honor that, make some space for that as well. And then say, one of the things I said is like, hey, can I bring my restorative forward here a little bit? All right, I see the good. Can I bring it forward? And Erin said,
yes.
Yes. And so I was able to kind of speak to things, but also I started to curtail my language where I, rather than saying things like, well, this could be a problem over here, I'd say, okay, this is a problem, but the likelihood of it happening is really like, I would say maybe like a 10%. So it's not a huge, but something to consider. And even that was like where I could tend to go catastrophic with my restorative. This is the melancholic side of me as well that can kind of tend towards that perfectionism and that, seeing the problems and even delighting in finding the problems. It was bringing a lot more reason in to the conversation. And we were able to both of us come together where I felt inclined at first. She offered something. My first inclination was like, no, I don't want to do that because risk. And when we had a good conversation and we allowed all of those, what IFS would say, parts of us to come forward and be heard, but also be subject to reason, we arrived at a decision that was really the fruits of both of our unique design coming together in a very virtuous way. And guys, that's amazing.
And it was a good decision. I think it's like, I think we've mitigated in our minds. We've already kind of identified the issues, the problems, and came up with a simple solution. So
she was heard. I was heard. It was just like, it was good. It was like, I want to do it again. That comes from,
let's do it more.
Yeah, let's do it more. That comes from the ownership. And even some of the language, like when you start to explore unique design is why we think it's so important. It starts to give a common language that you could share amongst your team. Yeah. Right? And so you can be like, okay, hey, this is a little bit my melancholic weakness showing up here. I recognize that. And just being able to say that, hold the space for it without judgment, or, hey, you know what? This is a contribution that I know I show up in. Can we make some space for this? All right.
Like, I'm very aware that I have like a million ideas, very aware of it. Like probably more aware than most people because they're happening inside my mind. And I also am aware of my sanguine tendency to overlook difficulties. And so when Matt asked, hey, can I bring this side where I can see this risk management side, I was like, yes, please, because I know I can overlook those things. Not that I don't see them, but it's just I can overlook even the difficulties on the team. Like, how much work will this be? Is this going to be a tremendous amount of work, or is this going to be like a quick edit on a website or something? Like, okay. So it's kind of understanding my own limitations and then opening it up for areas that Matt is gifted in.
Yes.
To receive that. And so that's where that really honest dialogue happens.
Yeah. But in the past, where this has gone, folks, is I would bring my catastrophic thinking forward, thinking that this is good, right? And it would totally clash with Erin's positive thinking. And both of us would stop. We would just shut down. We'd go protective. We wouldn't hold space for the value that the other person is bringing to the table. And then we would be frustrated and be like, okay, let's go be a team and let's go sit down and do a podcast together while we're totally pissed off at one another. Yeah. Like that is, and you can see how that's indicative of a lack of ownership and all of the emotional energy that gets invested in that. We would just be exhausted after those conversations. Yes. But this was very easy.
So easy. It was so easy. And I loved it, actually. Yes. So, okay. So you got curious about other people. You're less emotionally reactive. and you operate in the zone of influence.
We're going to talk more about that in the next podcast.
And you move outside of out of that manipulative zone.
Yes.
Or even just that shutting down zone, right? Like where you just go, okay, fine.
Yes.
Whatever.
Yeah. Okay. So what is this? Now let's tee up the next couple of episodes that we've got in front of us, Erin. So again, we're looking at mindsets. We're looking at unique design. We're going to be exploring this through the temperaments, right? Because the way that the choleric comes about owning something and the resistance to owning, right? Embodying this principle of ownership is going to be different from the sanguine. There may be motivations that the sanguine has that are off-putting to those of the melancholic. So we want to hold space for that. And that's what we're going to be exploring for the next couple of podcasts.
Yeah, the temperaments are patterns of inclinations and reactions to certain stimuli. And it's not like you are choleric and you have all of these reactions and you can never grow. Please hear me out. Look at the temperaments as a starting off point. It's like your disposition, but it doesn't mean that you can't grow in virtue and move out of those places. Please never use the temperaments as an excuse to not grow.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Like that drives me crazy when people do that. But it's a self-awareness tool to know where you're starting off from. But each one of them, like Matt was saying, each one of them carry their own patterns of mindset.
Yeah.
And so we are going to be bringing each other through this with our dominants and then our secondaries.
Yeah.
Really, we're going to be kind of sharing our own experience on where we kind of fear and lack this ownership and how to move out of that place.
Yeah. So that's really the work we got.
Yeah.
So by the time we're done with this podcast and you're done listening to this podcast series, you will know, based on your unique design, or at least through your temperament, how to go about and embody this principle of ownership. And guys, it's so foundational to moving to that place of persuasion. All right? Or influence. It's kind of both the same.
It is, but it's different because the word influence, actually the etymology of that word influence is different.
Inflowing, okay.
Yes.
Yeah, flowing into.
Well, influence, you become self-gift, right?
Yeah.
Which is very different. So
cool. Okay. All right. So we're going to be, as you go through this podcast series, you're going to start to learn some of the language. Remember, Erin and I just spoke about the language of how to communicate with people on your team, your contributions and weaknesses. We got a whole workshop actually that we do. We're now doing something for teams. We've got a leadership workshop for the temperaments where we help people on your team actually explore how they show up based on their temperament, how they show up as a leader and their contributions, motivations, those weaknesses, maybe even those triggers, how those things show up, ideal conditions, so that you can understand how to grow.
Yeah.
You, uniquely you, how to grow and into a more effective leader or effective contributor on your team. If you want to bring us in, you can book us.
Yes.
Right? Go to CatholicCoaching.com. Find an opportunity or reach out to Abby, right?
Yeah.
And connect with us there. So we're starting to do a little bit more workshops for parishes. We've got one. We're going to be going to Ave Maria University. Yep. We'll be doing a workshop for the RAs and the RDs. Really excited about that.
Yeah.
Anything to add there?
Nope. Because real leaders go first. And real leaders create teams of leaders.
Yes.
Okay? Don't think because you're the leader, you're the only one who can utilize this information. I promise you, if you are a leader, you want your team to know all of this stuff about them.
Yes.
Themselves.
And even this generation, one of the things that the kind of the millennial, call it the millennial generation, is seeking from their employer is somebody that is going to make investments in their own personal growth, right?
Yes.
Not just grow my capacity to produce more for the team, but see me as a person, invest in me and invest in my own personal development. That's more valuable
and
than
that
even
production. Well, I will say in that production will be an overflow of that. Usually the production that we all want at the end of this, if you're like really kind of creating, if you're on a business or on a team or whatever, you want to produce value at the end of it. But all of that becomes an overflow of investing in the person.
Yeah, they become engaged, right?
Yes.
There's this metric employee engagement that you're way out. And most employees, I was looking at a Gallup report, vast majority of employees are disengaged. Some are even actively disengaged, where it's almost sabotaging the organization. But just shrinking down that disengaged population by a few percentage points can have massive exponential impact on your productivity that just growing that actively engaged population. And it happens by making these types of investments in them. So call us up, invite us in. We'll help you guys get
fun.
your employees more engaged.
We can do them live or online too. So
yeah.
And also, guys, if you love this work, you want to take it deeper, check us out in our academy. We have tons of coaching in there. You get access to Matt and I in our coaching calls. We talk about strengths. We talk about all of this stuff. Mm-hmm. And we help you with your mind. So go check that out, CatholicCoaching.com. Join the academy. Do it for a month.
Do it for a month.
Give yourself that gift.
Cool. All right. We've also got certification right around the corner here, folks.
Ooh, yes.
All right. So I think even by the time this podcast airs, certification early bird is going to be getting ready to expire. That expires on the 27th of August. Mm-hmm. Okay. So keep that in mind. We've got a webinar that's going to be hitting here soon about just going through our fall cohort. Mm-hmm. All right. If you desire to actually accompany somebody through their journey as a coach, a confident, competent Catholic coach, coaching that's grounded in understanding of who the human person is through the lens of a Catholic anthropology, that's what we teach, right? That's what we train people to do, and we're darn good at it here, folks.
When's the actual close date for that, for the fall cohort?
Close card, I think, is September 23rd.
Something. Yeah.
I think it's 23rd. It's on Sunday, you know.
Okay, good. So, yeah. So it's going to be around September 23rd.
Yeah.
So you'd still have time. So come check it out. We have a brochure. We have lots of webinars that you can check out.
Yeah, CatholicCoaching.com. Just go to our drop-down menu there, and you'll find the certification page. You can download our brochure. And once you download the brochure, you'll get a lot of the information you're looking for. And you'll be getting our updates, too, via email.
All right, guys.
All right. See you at the next podcast.
We'll see you on the other side.
Hey, thanks for sticking with us in the Catholic Coaching Podcast. If you like what you heard,
please like and subscribe, and we'll see you again.